If you've ever tried taking a picture with a film camera and been disappointed with the results, this video is for you. Today, we'll discuss the most common mistakes beginner film photographers make and how to fix them. We'll talk about the closely guarded secret that is used exclusively by all the best film photographers. And you'll learn about all of the top secret tips, tricks, and hacks to really level up your film photography game. By the end of this video, you will be able to take better film photos than 90% of photographers out there. And you're not gonna need any fancy or expensive equipment to do it. And you don't need to memorize any complicated formulas or extreme composition techniques. Everything in this video is adapted for the beginner film photographer to be able to get up and running as quickly as possible with whatever film camera you have access to. So diving right in, the first thing we need to address is what kind of camera to use to get the best images possible. Some of the best and most iconic film photographs of all time were made by photographers who were not using the best and most expensive gear available. Like this photo of an unidentified Chinese man who stood in front of a column of tanks leaving Tiananmen Square on June 5th, 1989. Well, that shot was taken with a Nikon FE2, which also happens to be one of my favorite film cameras ever and takes just as good a photo as my Leica, but costs 10 times less. Even more famous than that photo though is this one from Steve McCurry taken in 1984 on a Nikon FM2, another camera you can pick up for a few $100. Even the iconic Earthrise photograph taken from lunar orbit by astronaut William Anders during the Apollo 8 mission way back in 1968 was shot on a Hasselblad camera that does cost a couple $1,000, but is still less than almost any other brand new full sensor digital camera that you can buy today. The takeaway point here being that you do not need an expensive camera to take absolutely amazing looking photos. And spending too much on gear, especially when you're first getting started, is gonna leave you even more disappointed if your photos don't turn out exactly like you were hoping for. So the question then is, what camera should you use? And the best advice that I can give you here is to use whatever you've got access to. But if you're in the market for your first film camera and you don't know where to start, then you really can't go wrong with a Pentax K1000, a Canon F1, A1 or AE1, a Nikon FM, FE2 or any other variation really, or an Olympus OM1. The Minolta X700 is pretty awesome too. Basically, you've got a lot of options and all of them are great. Camera choice really is a matter of personal preference, and the odds are good that the camera you shoot with today is gonna look very different from the one you're gonna wanna try out a year, a few months, maybe even a few days from now, thanks to gas. Gear acquisition syndrome. That unrelenting urge to buy and own cameras and film photography equipment as an anticipated catalyst of creative energy and a general bringer of happiness, and depleter of money. That said, if you're really serious about taking better photos, then you're gonna wanna choose a camera to get started with that gives you full manual control, so you can adjust your aperture and shutter speed to match whatever situation you're in, rather than having the camera do it all for you, like you would in a disposable camera or point and shoot option, like a Canon AF35M or Olympus Mu. Fortunately, most beginner and even advanced level film cameras do give you control, and you can quickly check which ones do and which ones don't just by taking a quick look at the top of the camera and the lens in order to make sure that you're seeing all these kind of complicated looking lines and numbers that we'll talk about later. But first, we've got to talk about another mistake, and one that has cost me more than a few rolls of film along my journey. I am, of course, talking about loading mistakes. You see, most film cameras allow you to advance the frame counter without actually having any film loaded, which means you could potentially shoot what you thought was an entire roll of film, only to open the back and realize later that it was empty the whole time. Or you could load the camera with film, but not have the film catch, and so again, you could shoot what you thought was a whole roll, only later to realize that what you shot was nothing. Nothing at all. The solution here is to spend a few extra minutes making sure that you've loaded the camera properly. Take your time and feed it into the take-up. Then, when you close the back and crank, make sure that the film rewind knob is rotating as you advance, which means that the film is being pulled from one side to the other. Pretty good sign. Then, when you're done shooting, don't forget to hit the rewind button, lever, or switch, and re-spool your film back into the original canister. Also, make sure to keep the back closed the entire time so you don't expose your whole roll to light and ruin all of your brand new pretty pictures. Speaking of exposing your film to light, next up we've got probably the most common beginner film photographer mistake of all, bad exposure. By far the biggest mistake I made when I was first getting started in film photography was underexposing basically all of my images. In other words, not providing my film with enough light to capture a clear, clean, and sharp image. and instead being left with a hot, muddy pile of garbage that had me strongly reconsidering why I even bothered to try film photography in the first place. Fortunately, I had a good lab help me out. More on that in just a minute. But they gave me some tips to help make sure that I nailed my exposure every single time. First, a quick intro or refresher on the basics of photography and the importance of the exposure triangle. When it comes to making sure you're exposing your image correctly, you've got 3 tools to play with. First, aperture, which refers to the opening of the lens to let light through to the film and is calibrated in f-stops and is generally written as numbers such as 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and 16. It's a lot of numbers. And most older film cameras are going to have the aperture adjustment on the lens. Next, you've got shutter speed, and this one is super simple, and it's just how fast your shutter is opening and closing in order to let light in. A fast shutter speed, like 1/500th of a second, 1/500, or 1/1000th of a second, 1/1000, usually shown on your camera as 500 or 1000, means that it's opening and closing super fast. And so not only will it keep out most of the light, which is good if it's a really bright day, but it's also going to freeze people and objects in time. A slower shutter speed, on the other hand, like 1/60, 1/30, or 1/8, being 1/60th of a second, 1/30th of a second, or 1/8th of a second, or sometimes even for entire seconds or minutes at a time if you're doing night shooting or long exposure stuff, means that the shutter is staying open for a much longer time. So a ton more light is coming through the lens, and anything moving in the frame is going to have a bit of a blurred effect to it, which can kind of be a useful tool to have depending on what kind of photo you're going for. Okay, then the third element of the exposure triangle is the easiest of all, because this one is about as set it and forget it as it gets. I am of course talking about ISO, which in film photography is strictly an element of what film stock you choose, and is basically always written right there in the title of it. So Kodak Portra 400 has an ISO of 400. Kodak Ektar 100 has an ISO of 100. And Cinestill 800T has an ISO of, yeah, you guessed it, 800. Sometimes though, they hide it just to be sneaky, like one of my favorite black and white film stocks, Ilford HP5. But don't worry, still there. You just gotta look a little harder to see that it is an ISO 400 film. Okay, so with that out of the way, here's where things get interesting, especially compared to digital photography. In digital photography, you typically wanna make sure not to overexpose your image and blow out your highlights, which will cause clipping and make the brightest part of your image super bright and devoid of any details. Most color negative film stocks, on the other hand, like Portra 400, Ektar 100, Gold 200, Fuji Superia 400, well, these are the complete opposite. And for most people, most of the time, you wanna make sure that you're spot on or slightly overexposing your film, as they do a whole lot better with too much light than not enough. This is why you'll sometimes hear film photographers talk about overexposing Portra 400 by one stop, simply by rating it as a 200 speed film, and then still metering for the shadows or midtones. This gives you a little extra margin of safety in order to make sure that your images come out properly exposed. So on that note, it's time to talk about metering and how to read light so you know what to use, when, and where. There are 3 methods that I like to use to meter for film photography, and I'll use any or all depending on what situation I'm in. The first, and arguably most accurate, is to use a dedicated light meter like a Sekonic L308. You just tell the meter what ISO film you're using, decide if you want to prioritize aperture or shutter speed, then hold the meter in front of the thing that you want to photograph to use incident metering, or slide the little white ball out of the way, point it in the direction of the shadows of what you're photographing, press the button on the side, and it'll give you a reading that it thinks is best. Another option though is to just use your phone. Simply install a light meter app on it, and there are a ton of them out there, some free, some paid. I personally use my Light Meter Pro as it does almost as good a job as my Sekonic light meter, but also costs 10 to 20 times less. The third option is to use the Sunny 16 rule that states that on sunny days at an aperture of f16, your shutter speed is the inverse of your ISO value. So, for example, if you're using Kodak Ektar 100, an ISO 100 film, if you set your camera at an aperture of f16 and ISO 100, your shutter speed should be 1/100th of a second, or 100. If you're shooting with Portra 400, a 400 ISO film, if you set your camera at an aperture of f16 and ISO 400, your shutter speed should be 1/400th of a second, or 400. But seeing as most cameras out there don't give you the option of 100 or 400, you can just pick whichever is closest. So 125 for Ektar 100 with an ISO of 100, and either 250 or 500 for the Portra 400 with an ISO of 400. From there, you can just adjust your aperture up or down depending on what kind of conditions are present that day. For example, the sunny 16 rule is when you photograph in an open field on a sunny day. There's the slight overcast 11 rule, which is where the sky is variable and you'd use f11. There's the overcast 8 rule. This is for cloudy weather, but not when it's dark. And the heavy overcast 5.6 rule. This is for bad weather, maybe when it's raining. Also the sunset 4 rule. This is for typical sunset conditions. And of course the snowy 22 rule. If the sun is shining over a snowy landscape, f22 is the suggested aperture here. And you'll get a balanced exposure using a shutter speed that is again the inverse of your ISO. And this is what makes choosing the right kind of film so important for the conditions you're going to be shooting in. After all, it's going to be hard to get a good exposure using an ISO 100 film at night, whereas you're likely to be hiding in the shadows if you're trying to get anything even remotely photogenic with an ISO 800 film in the middle of the day with the sun beating down on you. So let's talk about film selection now real quick. One of my favorite parts about film photography is just how many different films are available to use, each with their own distinct look and feel and grain structure. Looking for accurate skin tones for portraits? Well, you can't really go wrong with Portra 400. Want your landscapes to pop right off the page? Well, Ektar 100 is a pretty good match here. Want something a little more green? Well, that's where Fuji comes in with those dark, dense, danky green tones. But if you're looking for more gold, well, of course, got Kodak Gold 200. So while there is no right film for a beginner to use, there is probably a wrong film, which would be slide film, also called color positive film or color reversal film. It's a tricky beast with very little margin for error and also requires special processing that some labs don't offer. So you're best to keep it on the back shelf, at least for now. As for black and white film, it can be a whole lot of fun and is probably one of the easiest films to develop at home if you decide you might want to try out that in the future. For the time being though, you're best to outsource your film developing and scanning to a qualified lab. So let's talk about that next. When it comes to getting your film developed and scanned, you've got three options. Option one is to take it to your local grocery store or pharmacy or anywhere with a photo department, and many are still able to develop 35mm film. Option two is to take it to a dedicated film photography lab, either by finding one in your local area or using one of the many mail order film developing shops out there. And option three, you could do it yourself by investing in developing and scanning equipment. But from these three options, the only one you really want to avoid is option one. The grocery store option. Sure, it's cheaper and more convenient, and probably faster too, but none of those are good reasons to use them. After all, if you were after cheap and convenient and fast, you'd probably be shooting digital and not messing around with all this film stuff in the first place. A much better plan is to find a local or mail order film lab to do your developing and scanning for you. This is because A, they're going to know what they're doing, so there's a much greater chance that you're going to get back bangers instead of mash. B, they'll give you some way to get your negatives back, either by storing them for you to come by and pick them up, or mailing them back to you at some point in the future. And C, when they do their scans and apply any adjustments or corrections, you'll be able to provide more input over what kind of style you're after. Oh yeah, and D, most labs can also process not just regular color negative film, but also black and white, and slide film, and medium format, or 120 film, should you decide to take that leap later. Of all these reasons though, one of the most compelling is because you want to get your negatives back. These are the heart of your film photos and provide a physical, tangible record of your artistic genius. Not to mention, having your negatives also gives you the ability to rescan or re-edit in the future. And you definitely want to be able to edit your scans. So let's talk about this next mistake. Here's the deal. For some strange reason, some people think you shouldn't edit your film scans, but those people are what I like to call wrong. And here's why. First, every shot of film you take is altered in some way by the developing process, the chemicals used, the temperature it's developed at, and the time with which your film is processed are all going to give you different results. Next, when a lab develops and scans your film, whether they're experts at their craft or a grocery store intern on their very first day, they're still going to make a few tweaks and adjustments to it in regards to white balance, maybe exposure, and sometimes a whole lot more in order to give you back an image that they think you'll be happy with. Now, maybe their scans and vision line up with your creative vision, but more than likely, they won't. Whatever it is, editing your scans gives you full control and allows you to take advantage of some of the best aspects of shooting film by maybe taming down the highlights or boosting the shadows or making any other adjustments that you want. All that said, none of this matters if you make this next mistake, so let's cover that now to make sure it never happens to you. There's nothing worse than nailing your composition, getting your exposure perfectly dialed in, and then finding out later that your entire image was blurry and out of focus. Trust me, I've been there. Which is why, as simple as this next tip is going to sound, it's essential to understand how to focus your camera correctly. It's a crucial part of photography that sadly all too often gets overlooked. If you're shooting an SLR camera, then there are a number of different focusing screens you might be looking at, including all kinds of variations of split image and micro prisms. So make sure to spend a few minutes ahead of time getting to know how to dial in the sharpest image possible. So when you're out in the field, it becomes almost second nature to quickly snap things into focus. But basically, all you need to do is turn the focus ring until your subject is sharp. It's a traditional and reliable method and perfect for those who prefer hands-on control. Now, some more modern film cameras like the Canon EOS 3, which was launched in 1998, does have autofocus, where all you need to do is just half press the shutter button, and just like that, your subject is in focus. But even this isn't foolproof, and for close focusing, I still find myself switching it to manual. Rangefinder cameras like the Leica M cameras have a different focusing mechanism compared to SLRs. They use a double image method to achieve focus. When you look through the viewfinder, you'll see a smaller second image that you then need to align with the main one by turning the focus ring. Once the images are aligned, your photo is in focus. You're free to take your picture. I honestly don't have a preference for SLR versus rangefinder, but for speed, I do find rangefinder focusing to be just a little bit faster. Lastly, we need to talk about zone or scale focusing. Popular among street photographers and those using cameras without a focusing aid, like this bad boy right here, the Fuji GS645W. It's a whole lot of letters. Zone focusing involves setting your focus distance on the lens beforehand, relying on the depth of field to get your subject in focus. Basically, instead of viewing through the lens, you just guess or measure the distance between you and your subject, and then you set the focus ring accordingly based on that distance. Now, some people are great at this technique and can measure distances pretty accurately just by looking at them. Me, however, it's questionable, which is why I tend to only use zone focusing when shooting landscapes at infinity. And if you'd like even more film photography tips and tricks, then you might want to check out the video I've got linked up right here, as I think you're really gonna like it. So tap or click that now, and I'll see you in there in just a second.